All right, so we're going to go ahead and move forward here with a little bit more detail. This is kind of a recap, really, of the last video, but we're going to add some more details to the Apollonian, Dionysian elements and how they relate to Greek mythology in general, and how they relate to tragedy, right? When we get to, like, historically what he calls, sometimes Greek tragedy, but more specifically Attic tragedy. So again, quick recap. We're also in this video going to talk a little bit about, let me see. Oh yeah, that's right. The Legend of Salinas, and really, and more about kind of why is it that art is necessary to make life worth living, right? So a little bit more layers to that claim of Nietzsche's. And in the next video, we're going to get into this distinction that he makes between subjective and objective art, or subjective and objective artists, and a little bit about that. But and also here we'll talk, think a bit about the naive in art, naive artists, and what is naive art, and a little bit about that. Okay, so again, quick recap. We talked about all this in the last video. The Apollonian and the Dionysian are these two forces, these elements that have guided the development of all art, says Nietzsche, and they're forces in us, in nature, and they get expressed in art in different ways. So the Apollonian is the image-making element in art, image-making in sculpture, whereas the Dionysian is the imageless art of music, right? Or at least that's where it's embodied most obviously for Nietzsche. The Apollonian is based on dreaming. It's based on the dream world, on this experience of the human dream, of the images in our sleep, and our ability to imagine things that have this full, broad, and beautiful significance. Whereas the Dionysian is based on a sense of intoxication, sort of a sensual elation and ecstasy. The Apollonian he sees as the origin of poetry, and in this video we're talking even about how the Apollonian, not Apollo, not the god Apollo, but sort of, Apollo is a symbol for this yearning in us, right? This force, this Apollonian force. But as a force, as the Apollonian force, he's the origin of the gods, of all gods, and of poetry, etc. The Dionysian involves a complete breakdown of the principium individuationis, right? The principle of individuation. We lose ourself, our sense of self, right? It renews bond between human beings. We feel at one with everybody. The Apollo is associated with prophecy, soothsaying, and the Dionysian again is associated more with this sense of intoxication, where the man is sort of no longer an artist, as Nietzsche puts it, but becomes a work of art because they lose their individuality, or the artist loses a sense of their self. Right? Maybe an actor on the stage is so immersed in their role that they become that person. Okay, and so he says that again, Attic tragedy, right? This development of Greek tragedy combines both of these elements, right? Both the Apollonian and the Dionysian. So the Greeks were the first to successfully merge these two elemental forces in their art, according to Nietzsche. And as I said already, he claims that this Apollonian force, the same drive that assumes the form of Apollo in Greek mythology, he thinks this actually gave birth to the entire Olympian world, right? The whole mythos of the Olympian gods, right? All Zeus, Poseidon, you name it, all the 12 main gods of the Olympian canon, the pantheon, really were given birth through this same drive that is personified in Apollo. So he has a special place of eminence amongst the Greek gods. So we must not be misled by the fact that Apollo stands side by side with the others as an individual deity without any claim to priority of rank. For the same impulse which embodied itself in Apollo gave birth in general to this entire Olympian world. And so in this sense, Apollo is its father. What terrific need was it that could produce such an illustrious company of Olympian beings? Okay, so there was a need in us, right? Humans created these myths, Nietzsche's making this claim, out of the need, right? They were projected, they were developed out of a desire, a human need, which he's calling the Apollonian. So in that sense, Apollo has eminence here. Now don't be confused. Maybe some people might, well, I thought Zeus was the king, right? I thought he was the most... Yes, but that's not the point Nietzsche's making, right? He says that as an elemental force, the Apollonian force in us is what is personified in the god Apollo. And that elemental force is what makes us even make up things like the Olympian pantheon. Why did the Greeks come up with this? Okay. What was the need for this? Why did the Greeks feel the need to invent these gods? Well, we get to the Legend of Salinas. Very dark humor, I guess you could say, kind of gallows humor, very nihilistic humor. But it is, I think Nietzsche wants us to take it pretty serious, right? You might get a chuckle at the punchline. It's kind of morbid, but he wants us to take this serious, and he thinks that the Greeks took this serious. And because they took this Legend of Salinas, the question it poses, or the challenge, probably is a better way of putting it, the challenge that it poses, if you take it serious, it's quite a challenge. And Nietzsche thinks that the Greeks faced that challenge with their tragedy in a way that was unprecedented, and he thinks quite impressive. And we're not going to get into the later parts of this essay, right? We're only going to get through the first 15 sections. But when he was writing this, he seemed to believe that the opera of Richard Wagner, his friend and mentor, was the way to give a rebirth to tragedy, right? To bring these elements back together and to answer this challenge that is posed in the Legend of Salinas, right? So what does Nietzsche say about this legend? He says it expresses the relationship between the ecstatic vision of a tortured martyr and his torments. Okay, so the tortured martyr, the one who sacrifices himself, and he's having these visions of ecstasy, and he's got a relationship between his torments, right? Okay, there's an ecstatic vision that he has, but yet he's tortured somehow. This is all very confusing. Hopefully in this video, or maybe by the next 2 or 3 videos, it'll be less so when we especially when we look at the Greek response to the challenge posed by Salinas. There's an ancient story that King Midas hunted in the forest a long time for the wise Salinas, the companion of Dionysius, without capturing him. When Salinas at last fell into his hands, the king asked what was the best and most desirable of all things for man. Fixed and immovable, the demigod said not a word, till at last, urged by the king, he gave a shrill laugh and broke out into these words: "O wretched, ephemeral race, children of chance and misery, why do ye compel me to tell you what it were most expedient for you not to hear? What is best of all is beyond your reach forever. Not to be born, not to be nothing. But the second best for you is quickly to die." Very sad story, right? If this is true, so existence is that bad? Yes, says Salinas, right? What's best is that you never existed, right? Life is pain, right? Life is suffering, right? The Buddhist says, right? Or that's not the best translation, right? Life is dukkha, right? We live in a world where we have hopes and we have dreams and we have fears and we have loves, and none of it's permanent. Everything that we love and we cherish and we hope for is somehow going to be lost at some time. And when we reflect on the vastness of the universe, right? When we reflect on how big everything is and how small we are in comparison, and how long it's been around and how small our life is in that sort of perspective, it sort of makes us feel like insignificant, right? Like, what's it all for? And this pain and suffering is just all for naught, is sort of the point. This is a very nihilistic view of the world, but this is one that Nietzsche holds is true. And he's being a pessimist just like Schopenhauer taught him. This is something I think that he never gives up. This is not just Schopenhauer. This is, I think, Nietzsche really does, even in his later work, maintains this, right? So how is this tied to the Apollonian? How is this tied to the question he asked earlier, right? What was the terrific need that could produce such illustrious company of Olympian beings, right? There's this need to answer that challenge, right? Well, wait a minute. I think life is worth it. I don't think you're right? But this requires art. This requires myth. This requires religion. We have to have an answer. We have to make a purpose for ourselves. And this is what the Greeks did in their mythology, right? In their religion, we should say. Perhaps we may picture the process to ourselves somewhat as follows. Out of the original Titan thearchy of terror, the Olympian thearchy of joy gradually evolved through the Apollonian impulse towards beauty. Just as rosebud from thorny bushes. A rosebud from thorny bushes. How else could this people, so sensitive, so vehement in its desires, so singularly constituted for suffering, how could they have endured existence if it had not been revealed to them in their gods, surrounded with a higher glory? So he thinks there's a unique ability for suffering that is allowed for because of their beliefs. The ancient Greeks, because they believed in the Olympian pantheon, because they believed in the Olympian gods, it allowed them to endure the suffering of existence, the torment of life, right? And again, this was a sort of triumph over the Titans, right? This is the Titans versus the Olympians. If you're not familiar with the Greek mythology, the Titans in general seem to be, I mean, I could be wrong about this, there might be a few exceptions, but for the most part, they're elemental forces, right? They're forces of nature, and they're very unforgiving, okay? So you can imagine sort of the early Greeks without their Olympian gods, before you get the Homeric poems, the Homeric epics, before Hesiod really talks about any of this stuff, and there's the overthrow of the Titans, you can imagine that perhaps the Titans, the Titanic gods, fates and strife and all these things, okay? They were personification of very impersonal and very alien forces that were, I know people love nature. I love nature. I do hiking. But you can imagine if you're trying to struggle with nature, it can be something that is quite frightening and foreboding. But these Titanic gods, there was too much for a culture to bear for too long. And so this Apollonian impulse towards beauty, in response to this, grew like a rosebud from thorny bushes. This theology, this thearchy, as he puts it, of the Olympian gods, okay? The same impulse which calls art into being as the complement and consummation of existence. Right? The same impulse that makes us be artists ourselves and come up with a worldview and a picture of reality that we think is aesthetically, satisfactory, that answers that negativity of Salinas, right? That same impulse, which again calls art into being as a complement and consummation of existence, seducing one to the continuation of life and lets you go on living. This was also the cause of the Olympian world. Thus do the gods justify the life of man in that they themselves live it. The only satisfactory theodicy, says Nietzsche, okay? We covered that term already. You might not remember, but a theodicy, it's a theory that's trying to explain pain, suffering, misery, evil, all this stuff. How does this stuff exist if there are these divine forces, if there's a God who's good and just? But he thinks that the Greeks had it right. Nietzsche famously is a pretty critical philosopher of the Christian faith and theology. And so he's not going to like their answer to this question, but he thinks the Greeks had it right because the gods justify our life and that they themselves live it. The Greek gods were not perfect. I guess that would be sacrilege to say, but if you look at their stories, right? If you're an ancient Greek, you couldn't say they're not perfect, but Zeus would go cheat on his wife, and They had all these, they seemed to be jealous of each other. They had their intrigues and they had all their struggles just like we do, right? So we see ourselves reflected in the gods. So when we look at our own life and we're like, geez, look how screwed up it is, and I can't get things to work out, and we can live, hey, even Zeus had problems. Even Zeus was in the doghouse for a little while, right? For Nietzsche, this is the only satisfactory Theodicy. And we see this in the work of Homer, right? The first naive artist, he says, right? This Homeric naivete, right? He's the one that wrote the Iliad, the Odyssey, right? He presents us with the world of the orderly, beautiful world, yet so somewhat familiar and human world of the Olympian gods. So the Homeric naivete, Nietzsche says, is a complete victory of Apollonian illusion. Wherever we meet with the naive in art, we recognize the highest effect of the Apollonian culture, which in the first place always has to overthrow some titanic empire and slay monsters, and which, through its potent, dazzling representations and its pleasurable illusions, must have triumphed over a terrible depth of world contemplation and a most keen sensitivity to suffering. But how seldom do we attain to the naive, that complete absorption in the beauty of appearance. So I guess this is Homer's genius, is his ability to be so naive, right? To picture a beautiful, orderly, meaningful picture, a full picture of the world in stark contrast to the reality that really we have to live and suffer in our lives, right? How amazing this is, right? It required, Nietzsche thinks, a titanic overthrow of the Titanic Empire and slaying of monsters, facing that story of Salinas, facing squarely, face to face with the truth of Salinas, and saying, yeah, but I'm gonna still make this beautiful story. I'm gonna be naive. I'm gonna pretend that's not true, and I'm gonna live my life. I'm gonna have this wonderful, joyous exuberance, and accept it all, warts and all. This is all. I think maybe I'm interjecting a little bit of later Nietzsche into this. I gotta confess, but I do see, despite all of the influence of Schopenhauer, I do see some of this early thought of his as definitely parallel, or maybe an early, less developed appearance of later ideas that he holds on to throughout his life. But he always maintained a respect, Nietzsche did, for, I think, the Greek culture. And I think so much so, and he says so much good stuff about the Greeks, I think a lot of critics and scholars misread him about this. I think that if you're a Nietzsche specialist, you usually don't. If you really read him a lot, you know him pretty well. But I find that people that just have sort of a basic understanding of Nietzsche make this misguided inference that because he had such good things to say about the Greeks, that he wants us to return to a sort of Greek culture. I don't think that he ever thought that, really. But he did admire them, obviously, right? And the Greeks, the will, Schopenhauer speak, right? The will wished to contemplate itself in the transfiguration of genius and the world of art. In order to glorify themselves, its creatures had to feel themselves worthy of glory. They had to behold themselves again in a higher sphere. Without this perfect world of contemplation acting as a command or a reproach. Such is the sphere of beauty, in which they saw their mirrored images, the Olympians. Again, they saw themselves reflected, even their own shortcomings, their own flaws, their own inability to get exactly what they wanted all the time. They even saw this in the trials and the tribulations of the Greek gods. Even they had to make compromises. Even Zeus had to make compromise with Hades, right, to get the seasons going, right, because he kept Persephone. You know the story, right? So again, Nietzsche thinks this is a good way that the Apollonian sort of makes itself manifest in art. I think I'm actually going to skip these next two slides because they're really abstract elaboration on what we've already kind of talked about. But Nietzsche, interestingly enough, sees Raphael, if you're familiar at all with Raphael, the Renaissance painter, not the Ninja Turtle, he's considered by many one of the greatest painters of all time. Nietzsche, I think, shares that sentiment. But Nietzsche sees him as a naive artist. And this is Raphael's last painting. This is his last finished work. It's the Transfiguration. And again, Nietzsche thinks that this painting is a sort of Apollonian expression. There are Dionysian elements in here, though, interestingly enough. The Dionysian is always there. In a sense, you might say that Salinas himself and his sinister, remember, he's a companion of Dionysius, right? That is an Apollonian element that underlies, that's a Dionysian element that underlies even this naive Apollonian art, right? So Nietzsche, let's read this passage here where Nietzsche's kind of giving us his reading of this famous painting by Raphael, and how is this a kind of a representation of the Apollonian. So in the symbolic painting of Raphael himself, one of these immortal naive ones, has represented for us this devolution of appearance to appearance, right? So we have the appearance of the world, right? The world, again, more Schopenhauer, the world that as it appears to us, and from that sort of strife and struggle that we deal with in our everyday existence, we make an appearance of that in art, in this Apollonian art, to kind of help us deal with it. It's a reflexive thing. So this devolution from appearance to appearance, Raphael has represented this to us. The primitive process of the naive artist of Apollonian culture. So we can see this in his work, says Nietzsche. In his Transfiguration, in the lower half of the picture, with the possessed boy, right? The possessed boy and his mother, please, Jesus, my son, exorcise him, right? The despairing bearers, right? They're holding the child, please, Jesus, please. The bewildered, terrified disciples, what is he going to do? Isn't he going to help her, right? This sort of shows us the reflection of suffering, primal and eternal, the sole basis of the world. The appearance here is the counter appearance of eternal contradiction, the Father of all things, right? The eternal Father. From this appearance now arises like an ambrosial vapor, a new visionary world of appearances, invisible to those wrapped up in the first appearance, those that are worried about the trials and tribulations of of life, right, of reality as we live it, right, of our waking life. Right, invisible to those wrapped in the first appearance, a radiant floating in pure bliss, a serene contemplation beaming from wide open eyes. Here we have presented the most sublime artistic symbolism, that Apollonian world of beauty and its substratum, right? The Apollonian world of beauty and its substratum, the terrible wisdom of Salinas. And intuitively, we comprehend their necessary independence, right? The Apollonian, in this case, in the naive art, is a response to that ugly truth of the terribleness and transitoriness of our own earthly existence, right? It's a reflex, it's a reaction to this. And so we're going to go ahead, I guess this is a really good place to stop the video. We're going to talk about sort of the ethics or the ethos that you get. Oh, actually, you know what? No, there's three more slides here. Let's go over these real quick, and that way we can actually start the next video on his distinction between subjective artist and objective artist. And it's not like you think, if you watched my Schopenhauer videos, you might be thinking, because Schopenhauer makes a similar claim about objective and subjective art, but there's something a little bit different about what Nietzsche's saying here, okay? And also, maybe I should, before I move on to these last few slides, there's one thing I need to mention, I forgot. This, I think, is another example of a step away from Schopenhauer, right? He's not just a Schopenhauer a wannabe or just a copycat. Remember, Schopenhauer hated symbolism in art. Schopenhauer hated allegory in art. He thought that detracted from beauty. But no, for Nietzsche, this painting is a symbolic representation of these two forces, and he loved it. He loved Raphael. Okay, so again, there's a sort of ethos, sort of ethics that is represented by Apollo in art, okay? He's an ethical deity, right? He provides order, right? So the Apollonian element, right? Christ is the figure that brings order and the law. The kingdom of heaven, right, is within you, right? Follow me, right? Let go of your worldly possessions, right? Let go of that strife, right? That solace is always there, right? But it's an ethical imperative, right? So he's this ethical deity. He exacts measure of his disciples, right? Not only does he set boundaries, he exacts measure. And to this end, he requires self-knowledge. And so side by side with the ascetic necessity for beauty, there occur the demands, know thyself, and nothing overmuch, right? These are the Apollonian creeds. They were carved above the temple in Delphi, where the Delphic oracle, who is said to speak for Apollo, or he spoke through her, he possessed her and spoke through her, right? Those were the creeds that were written above the door. Know thyself, nothing too much. Consequently, pride and excess are regarded as the truly inimical demons of the non-Apollonian sphere, hence as characteristics of a pre-Apollonian age, that of the Titans, and of the extra-Apollonian world, that of the barbarians, right? The foreigners, the exotic, right? Again, this is very xenophobic, but Nietzsche's just talking about this is something that we have in us, whether we like it or not, he's going to say. This is characteristic of a pre-Apollonian age, that of the Titans, and extra-Apollonian world, that of the barbarians. Because of his Titan-like love for man, Prometheus, which we're going to see is a tragic figure, we'll talk about that in a later video, right? Someone like Prometheus has to be torn to pieces by vultures, right? He trespasses boundaries, right? He oversteps his measure, right? So he must be punished. Because of his excessive wisdom, which could solve the riddle of the Sphinx, Oedipus must be plunged into a bewildering vortex of crime. Again, Oedipus is an example of a tragic figure that Nietzsche's going to explore, and he has overstepped a boundary through his wisdom, his excessive wisdom. Too much, nothing too much. Don't be too smart, smarty pants. It's going to come back to bite you, right? He gets sucked into this vortex of crime. Thus did the Delphic god interpret the past, right? The Delphic god is Apollo. The Delphic oracle is the priestess who gets possessed. Apparently the Greeks believed she was possessed by his spirit and would speak for Apollo. Similarly, though, the Dionysian, right, is titanic and barbaric, right? Whereas the Apollonian is orderly and measured. The Apollonian, nothing too much and, nothing foreign. The Dionysius is everything but all that, right? Similarly, the effects wrought by the Dionysian seem Titan-like and barbaric to the Apollonian Greek, while at the same time, he could not conceal from himself that he too was inwardly related to these overthrown titans and heroes. Indeed, he had to recognize, even more than this, despite all its beauty and moderation, his entire existence rested on a hidden substratum of suffering and of knowledge, which was again revealed to him by the Dionysian. And lo, Apollo could not live without Dionysius. The Titanic and barbaric were, in the last analysis, as necessary as the Apollonian. Right? We've already spoken about this, so I won't dwell on it too much, but this need for an answer to Salinas is a Dionysian sort of impulse. And so it's from that impulse that the Apollonian springs in a certain sense, right? So it's in reflect, as a reflex to that terrible, terrible truth of Salinas, that pessimistic truth. We create these Apollonian worlds of beauty as a response. And this all fits together very nicely for Nietzsche in the art of Greek tragedy. The sublime and celebrated art of Attic tragedy and the dramatic dithyramb presents itself as the common goal of both these tendencies, whose mysterious union, after many and long precursory struggles, found glorious consummation in this child, at once Antigone and Cassandra. Okay? Now, in the next few videos, we're going to get into all these long and precursory struggles. He's going to go over a short, brief history of the development of these two tendencies in Greek art. It gets a little tedious, so I'm going to try to cut some of this short and not go through all the details, right? But we'll get a general idea of how these two tendencies of Apollonian and Dionysian develop themselves in different art forms in the Greek world, and eventually culminated for Nietzsche in this great art of tragedy. At the same time, Antigone, the calm, dutiful, sweet daughter of Oedipus, and Cassandra, right? The cursed, wretched woman who knows everything and can predict the future, but nobody believes her, right? These two tragic figures, right? They come together in the work of Greek tragedy, right? The work of art, right? The Dionysian Apollonian find balance together. Again, like I said, next video, we'll get into the subjective and the objective artist, what the difference is. Ultimately, Nietzsche's going to reject the term subjective artist. He doesn't really like it. but he's going to, kind of explain the distinction that has been made so far in our theory, and ultimately give his take on what's going on in this distinction. Okay, so I'll save that for a later video. We'll stop it here. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I'll see you on the other side.